Hello everyone, welcome again. So the thought process is quite long for this, and I'm gonna try to break it down into videos. I think it's very important. We won't be having a lot of technical stuff this week, but I think this is crucial to understand what went into making this. So I was saying that the idea for the crack was too hard, and I wanted to focus on this shot more and make the ground collapse look really nice. And then obviously I started coming up with a list of ideas. So okay, I have ground collapse, and then the spaceship is gonna rise. But now we're close up. We're very close to the shot. If I'm just gonna do that, it's not gonna look very interesting. At least for me, I need to make it more dynamic. So I started developing ideas, which I'm gonna show, and that's where after trying different things, I ended up with this crack that is expanding this magical force, and then I implemented that. I did R&D. It worked. And the first time I did the ground collapse, I didn't have any fire. It was just that lightning. It's gonna cause the ground to get destroyed, and then after it gets destroyed, the spaceship is gonna come up. It's gonna have a lot of smoke, which is basically all this without the fire. And then I was showing it to a couple of my friends, and Igor said, "What if after the crack, we get fire burning underneath the ground? It shows that this spaceship is living in a hot environment." And I told him, like, that's a great idea. So I started developing. I took a small section and started doing R&D, and it worked. It looked nice. It looked very interesting. And I already have the setup for the fire from the other shot, which I already started, and that includes sparks. And I just replugged that in, did a quick test, and I knew it was gonna work. And so I added the fire in, and then with the fire comes a lot of responsibility. So I wanted to have the fire follow through the cracks nicely. You can see, so I'm gonna zoom in. You can see here rocks falling, and the fire is only emitted where there is gaps. It's dynamic. It's not fake. It's actually following the correct geometry. And this area, because there's a lot of destruction there's a lot of gap, we see more fire, but it's natural. It's because there's more gaps underneath. And see, it didn't crack enough. It's just where you see cracks, you're gonna get fire. So this is the emission is based on the destruction geometry. And that looked nice, and I wanted to get some nice emission from these cracks, so I want them to make sure that they burn. I can see that something is hot underneath them. So that's something visual, which I will talk about. I'll continue talking about this, so to cover all the points. And again, so this is the initial idea, which is the top shot, and this is where everything started, and then I switched to focus more on the ground collapse. But this is where I did the fire and sparks R&D. Here you can see I have fire and I have sparks, and I have a lot of atmo. I have the lava, and I built the geometry as well. So I've gathered all the images that I think will have useful information, and I'm just gonna go over them and talk about them, share some information, and to give you guys some ideas. And again, we don't have a concept artist. We don't have a visual effects supervisor or James Cameron sitting telling us, I want this, it's gonna work, it's gonna look nice. We have to do stuff. We have to try things and see what works, see what doesn't work, see what we're capable of doing. And because it's our creation, unless I'm bound by a client, I'm not gonna obey that. If the topic or the scope is too hard, I'm not gonna follow, because it's just unrealistic for us to spend a year working on this. So I'm gonna show what I have. They're not in order, but they're grouped somewhat in a meaningful way, and I'm gonna go over them and show. show what I have and talk about what I did and what's happening. So this is a still image of the initial ground collapsing. It's a close-up, and then with the energy in there. And this energy, I can't remember now, but I have particles, I believe I have volume, and then as the ground expands, as this energy expands, it's actually shifting the ground. It's pushing the rocks away from each other. So as this travels like this, it's going to push the ground away from each other and rotate them. And that will give us more space to emit debris. And this is one of the frames. You can see here smoke is starting to emit, and this is debris coming off. And you can see the Voronoi pattern is quite visible. This render, I didn't have the edge displacement on yet, which we're going to talk about. So this is another frame. And this is a very old test that I did to see how the fire would look like. You can see the resolution is quite low, and it's not great, but I really liked what I saw, because all this flying debris, you have a light underneath it. It's gonna rotate and catch light every time it moves. It's gonna sparkle, basically. It's very, very interesting to look at. The fire, this hot pattern here, I love that. It looks very, very natural, and we've got all this nice emission. And then I can use this to also create the composition that I want. So I wanted to have a ring of fire, which is this, and then something in the center, and then everything else. So I wanted to use this in my advantage. And this is a great element, because we have a ring of fire that could generate a lot of interesting illumination to whatever is going to happen inside, versus if it wasn't there. And then we have the rest of the atmosphere, and we have the center, which we could use as the spaceship lifts off. And we'll talk about other ideas that I had. This is a very early test of high-res destruction and high-res geometry. You can see here there's a lot of details in the geometry, and there's edge displacement turned on. But the number of pieces, the number of geometry that I had is very low. So this is an initial test to see how it would look like if the spaceship, if the ground collapsed and the spaceship come off. So I wanted to do a test to see how it would look like. And then I saw that the rocks were getting stuck into the spaceship as it was coming up. So I needed to figure out something, because I didn't want that. I don't want them to get stuck, and they will get stuck. So I needed a solution. And during this discussion, I'm going to explain some of the problems that I ran into and how I solved them. And we'll get into individual details later. Okay, so this is a test, an old test that I did of the ground collapse, and some initial the fire, the sparks, this lightning is the main one, the last one. I didn't change it, but this is a test where I didn't have any fire. And this, at the time, I was using Houdini 18, which was in beta, and they added so much features towards the end. They added sparse solves, they added sparse water, they added RBD subsolver in the last minute, and it was hard for me to keep up, using the beta and the beta version, and still solving problems and things like that. But this was an initial test that I did with the smoke. And you can see that the smoke freezes, and that's because the sparse wasn't properly working at the time of the beta version. And also at this point, I wanted to start exploring different lighting scenarios. And I wanted to have, my initial idea, I wanted to have a very bright source, but not as wide as this. I wanted to have a straight line, like a laser, a very thin beam that will light everything that it hits. But I wasn't looking for that lightning itself. I was looking for the fall off of that. So I wanted to have some core, and then a nice decay from that. So whenever we have something in space or like a smoke flying, we're still gonna get a nice source of lighting inside it, and it's gonna create interesting illumination. And the doing the small light, you know, the very narrow one, was very, very expensive. So I ended up using an area light and keeping it at this radius because it wasn't, you know, it was working visually and it was giving me the lighting that I want. So I pursued that and didn't pursue the thin idea, the, you know, like a slice idea. I wanted to have, you know, like one thin line, and then as the spaceship comes up, it's gonna, a lot of lighting sources are going to be emitted, and that's gonna illuminate the scene. And I was happy with having all this pretty dark, you know, like a different tone, so that we have contrast. Okay, so let's talk more. So this is something, when I started doing the R&D, the ground collapse, I was looking at various references, and I will show I'll show a couple of them. So the main reference is the nuclear ground collapse. So they do nuclear explosion underneath the ground, which will causes a huge gap to be created, and that will cause the ground to collapse. And one reference that came to mind was Jaden Patterson reel. He had an amazing ground collapse with a spaceship coming, and I was looking at that reference, and I was looking at the real reference, and I was trying to get some elements from both of those. And this was an initial test that I did. I think the timing works really well, but it's still not there yet. I don't know what I was looking for. I wasn't happy with that result. So let's continue. So this is another test. Let's see this one. Yeah, so this is another version with the spaceship. Actually, it's a sphere coming off the ground. And I was looking for that timing, that beat where the ground hits and then something happens. So I was looking for the timing to find the perfect moment to, or the perfect timing for each element. And the ratio is, what I found is the impact, that the blast, the blue effect, needs to happen really quick, and then the majority of the time is spent on the collapse. And this is by looking at the real reference of the nuclear explosion, which I'll show once we find it. Okay, so let's continue. So this is a still image. Again, the images and the folders are not ordered, but they all contain useful information. So this is a high-res ground of the final geometry with edge displacement, and it's still rendering, so I just did a screen capture, and you can see it's working really, really well. This is a different angle pointing this way, and let's see. And I was also exploring the shading for this. You can see there's a lot of reflectiveness here, which looks really nice, but was a bit expensive, so I had to turn it off. And this is a preview of an upres, so which we will talk about later. And this is actually pretty good example. You can see the Voronoi pattern here everywhere, the fracture, the actual pieces, and you can see that everything that hits this, everything that is rising, is actually going to get fractured many, many, many times to create this nice crumbling feeling. Okay, let's continue. So this is a still image from R&D of the sparks. I was working on the effects, and I wanted to, looking at it, I wanted to make it feel massive. And the most fire, most references that you look at, you will see small tornadoes of fire happening here and there. And I wanted to recreate that effect. And this is something we're going to talk about, obviously, on how to implement that. But it's the idea, not the technique. I think the technique can be really, really simple. So you can see curves here everywhere, and those are causing turbulence, or the particles to swirl around them. And that's another preview. I don't have the twisting effect here implemented yet, but this is a preview of all the fire with all the sparks in there. This is a still image of the final render from the top. And this is a still image of the fire with the smoke and with nothing else. No sparks, nothing. And I was just testing, you know, making progress, testing things, iterating over each part for many, many days to find the perfect tune. And especially for this one, I really wanted to get some nice contrast when the ground was flat, when the ground was collapsing, when the ground is collapsed. And this worked really, really nice. You see, like, it hits here, you get this nice break, and then there's nice shadows. You will get all this debris projecting shadows here, and then we have this part which is orange, and then another part which is blue. And there's this two combinations with the geometry worked really, really well. There's other lighting sources here, but we'll get to that later. And again, this is not about 2D, this is about telling a story and how to use whatever you have to make it look more interesting. Let's see, we talked about that. Okay, so this is the references. I'm gonna include this one. So this is the animation references that I was looking at, and this is a nuclear explosion with showing a ground collapsing and then a smoke happening from the cracks. Now this is large, this is really big, and you can see the crack pattern is quite uniform. You get these uniform rings like this, and then once the ripple happens, it's going to emit smoke from those cracks. This is a great path to pursue if you wanted to get that uniform pattern. I didn't want to do that. I wanted something more organic, especially with the idea of the lightning. I wanted it to be more organic, but if you wanted to create this pattern, you can definitely do that. And in terms of timing, you can see how much time from 0 all the way to 120, so almost 5 seconds, 6 seconds, and then you get this first wave of white. It's not the smoke yet, it's just disruption on the ground, and then only at frame 140 is when you start to get this boom, 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 boom effect, and it happens very, very quickly. So studying clips like this is very, very important, and to find the timing, because now, okay, I can spend, when I do my sims, it has to be 5 seconds for the ground collapse, and it starts really small and quickly gets here. You know, the ring expansion, it happens rather quick. It's not, let me see. So it gets here, the entire ring is visible. That's where the effects is going to happen, but it's still collapsing. You see, it's still falling down. And so that's something we can implement. I didn't do, but that's something you can implement, where you have the ring expanding and the ground falling, and then as it continues, it still falls. As this happens, the ground is still falling. So studying these clips will give us an indication as to how long each section can be, but I didn't want it to follow this 100%. You know, I just like the beginning, and then this part here, to me, it's very slow. You know, like this, all this is very slow. I want it to happen a lot faster, maybe 3 times faster. So I wanted to show Jaden's shot. And so this is Jaden's shot. And we can also look at the timing. So 0 and then 75. He only spent 70 frames on the ground collapse, and then you see the smoke starting rather quickly. But also they have some fake comp during here. You can see this mask revealing 2 different layers, and this is painted, or it's CG, but but painted on top. It's just a mask revealing. So there is a comp trick here, which I didn't use. I'm not going to rely on that because I wanted everything to be in scene. And then the smoke here may not even be emitted from the cracks itself. And this is a break of the geometry. So that, yeah, so these two versions, and then various layers and smoke. And this, you can see the smoke is not coming from the cracks. It's just an emission. But the timing is perfect. The timing of this shot is amazing. So I was studying the timing here and trying to find something that that works for me. Not this one. So these are other clips. I think it's the same one, just different camera. Yeah, it's the same one. Let's see this one. So this is a close-up. You can see the ground. Yeah, this is very slow collapse, very slow emission for what I wanted to achieve. But it's a great reference. You can see how long it takes. 0 to, well, it takes maybe, yeah, 15 frames, 15 seconds. And then you have the smoke effect. So that's another reference I was looking at. And then let's see. Yeah, I think it's the same. They're all the same. I don't think a lot of people recorded something like this, but that's the reference I was looking at. I wanted to have a ground collapse, and I wanted to use these as the keys, or the key for timing, just to give me an idea of how much time I can spend on the ground collapse, how quick the expansion needs to be, and so on and so forth. But I ended up changing pretty much everything to suit me. Now this is the image I was talking about. It's from a guy named Andreas Rocha, and you can Google him. He's a great artist. He has a lot of cool stuff. You can definitely get a lot of ideas from. And I wanted to create this environment. And obviously I didn't want to copy the same thing, but I wanted to have some sort of crack, and then both sides are here, they're far away, and then as we travel in perspective, as we go deeper, it's going to get narrower and narrower. And I wanted to have the spaceship at the end, but you could definitely recreate this if you wanted to, but I wanted to have something a bit more different. And then I started with this. This is what started the initial project. I wanted to have a crack in the ground, lots of lava, and cool rocks, and I wanted to have a lot of sparks, fire coming off these cracks, maybe flowing lava here, flowing lava in the center, and I wanted to have this huge hot atmosphere, which turned out to be really hard and challenging to achieve, because the visual is really hard to build something this vast and still sell the scale, the hotness of the environment, and have effect and have rendering, have simulation integrate into it. It's a lot of work. So as I made progress on it, I realized that I need to scale down the scope and focus on one shot, which ended up the ground collapse. So that's the animation graph. Same. Okay, let's continue. So this is initial R&Ds from the ground collapse. Sorry, from the crack. And I was building the environment. I'm done with the environment. I wanted to start exploring various bits and pieces. And this includes look dev for the lava, look dev for the rocks, and I wanted to start looking at the spaceship. What can I add? Also did this camera move because I wanted to see how it would work from different angles. And the one thing that comes off, or I wanted to have this spaceship with something inside the crack flowing through, and maybe do some sims in there. But looking at this, it didn't work well. You know, we have this perspective, this alignment of rocks, and then we have this object standing up. It didn't suit the framing. It didn't work well with the framing. So I decided to change the spaceship, which is this one. And I'll talk more about that once we get there. So this is more tests to see the entire environment. And this environment is not the same one I used in the ground collapse. It's the one with the rocks, and I'm gonna provide all of this. So we have this block here on the left, this block on the right. They are blended into a rocky surface, a rocky terrain, and that's being copied a few times. That's basically how I'm building it. And every time it just put them closer to each other, pardon me, and they actually close on each other. If you push them all the way through, you will be able to close the gaps. Just these cracks will still be there. So you can 100% close it. And another idea that Igor was suggesting is to have some ground here in the beginning of the shot and have it crumble and collapse onto the lava. But it was just too hard, too slow for me to have this entire huge environment and the effects as well. So as I was working on this, looking at the various images, this is where the ground collapse is going to happen. I didn't like the spaceship. And the spaceship I've bought from this guy, not this guy. This guy, millionth vector. And it's a great model. And we've bought the rights to it, so we're going to include it with this workshop. And the version that I have is actually a modified version of this that I'm also going to include. So not this one. Okay, so let's get back. So we're going to include that spaceship. And this is the second iteration on the spaceship. So you can see it's the same one. There's a version here, the one that was vertical, but I rotated it and made two copies, one pointing to the left and mirrored it one to the right, and that's how I got my spaceship. And I like this silhouette because it's easy to frame, it's easy to embed in the crack. And at this point I didn't have the idea of the ground collapse yet. I was just trying to get this to work as good as possible. And by that time I was done with the lava. I had the lava flowing and I had cracks, and these are individual sims, high-res sims with sparks following the motion of the smoke, and I needed to simulate all this. So each one of them is actually very, very high res, and I set up a system for clustering, and basically you work on one crack and then you say, okay, now go sim all the other cracks. Everything was named properly, everything was easy to read. And then yeah, we'll talk more about the problems later, but there's more issues on how to manage this and render this that I had to solve, which I did, and also all the smoke. And at this point, when doing this, I was trying to make it to look as good as possible. So I wanted to have the spaceship to have lightning obviously affect this. Even though it's not realistic, it works because this fire is supposed to be super, super bright. Nothing else will be able to compete with it. But I wanted to have something blue here or something different as the spaceship travels to show and reveal how the smoke is interacting. Another thing that was quite expensive is the specular here. It's actually a reflection. And to get that, to get the reflection of all this fire from this angle was quite expensive to render, because each ray will probably hit something or a lot of this smoke and particles, and that needs to be reflected. So it was quite hard. Okay, so let's continue. More stills from this environment. I'm just going to go over the various images, and show what I did. So this is a test with the initial geometry. You can see there is no illumination in the cracks, and then I did illumination here in these cracks to make it look more interesting. And this is an initial idea for a ground collapse. Maybe I can show a clip. I'm gonna delete this because we already saw it. I'm gonna delete these two. Yes. Okay, so I was working on the crack and I wanted to try different ideas. Okay, what if instead of, before I got to the point to have the lightning idea, I wanted to say, okay, what if the ground starts collapsing and as soon as the rock separates, something is gonna escape. Something is gonna escape from the crack. And I started experimenting. So okay, I can emit a lot of sparks. Those sparks will emit a lot of debris, and then I'm gonna get a lot of interesting illumination. So I started exploring this. But this is another one with smoke, debris is being emitted. You can see the smoke. You can see particles are sliding here. And I wanted to explore this idea, and the spaceship is starting to come off. I wanted to explore this idea, but the main issue I was having is that it didn't have this something impactful. You know, it was very slow. If we see the same thing over and over for many, many seconds, I didn't want that. I wanted to have timing. I wanted to have action, delay, and action, reaction, and delay, or something like that. And this was just, it didn't have that momentum. It didn't have that feel. So I stopped pursuing that path. Okay, let's continue. So this is an earlier test of the lava with the crack environment, and I was testing using an older spaceship. This is the one we used for Rise, a very old version of Rise that Igor and I did. And I was testing to see, okay, what is this going to look like? And I was exploring with the shading. I was trying different ideas for the. You can see there's a lot of details here. I wanted to make it feel more interesting. And then I started experimenting with some ideas. What if the spaceship, as it travels through, it's going to attract energy to it? You know, it's sucking something from the atmosphere. And I wanted to have this kind of aurora effect in there, just to see how it may look like. And this one idea that I didn't pursue. So another test of look dev for the rock and the environment with the spaceship added, different frame for the spaceship, and the spaceship was red at this frame, and then a different version. And this is a very early test of the fire using Houdini 18. And then a different framing with this spaceship, and I actually liked this. The first time I did this angle, I liked it because the camera is at the same distance. It's somewhat the same distance from everything we see. So if I optimize it to work in here, it's gonna be fine. The other one with the depth, each volume is behind the other one. Each volume is behind the one next to it. That traversing, that depth is gonna be really, really hard to render. So for me, looking at them at this angle is actually going to be easier to render. You know, I don't know if that makes sense. It does, because if you put 10 volumes, one behind each other, to see the last one, you have the Arnold or the render has to traverse all those volumes to calculate and come back. If we look at them from the top, we don't have to do that. And that's why I liked this angle, because it was easier to render and I think it could work. And it also gave me an opportunity where I could blend this even if I didn't have the crack or the ground collapse in here. Okay, so this is another frame. I was working more on the lava shader, doing tweaks in comp. You can see here there's some haze, some sky glow and stuff like that, and it was okay, but it didn't click yet. This one, it clicked. This one I really liked because the spaceship sells really well. I liked, you can see the framing is perfect. We have this almost like the golden ratio, you can feel that this is well positioned. This triangle here. This triangle here is of the same proportions, and then we have another triangle. So there's nice composition in this framing. I really like this one, and I wanted to pursue it. It's just that it was too slow for me to include towards the end. That's why I did the front shot, but I wanted to have something like this. And the blue effect is working. If this is gonna travel through with some nice smoke, haze, and particles, it's gonna look really, really nice. And with this, I was also exploring the environment, the time of day, what kind of lighting are we in? Are we at daytime? Are we at nighttime? And how I'm gonna balance all of that, because if I wanted to have dark environment, then this rocks means it has to be magma-like. It has to be really dark. So I was trying all these compositions to see what could work. And every time I come back to this, it worked. This one clicks really well. So that's the one I pursued. If I had time, I would go finish this one for sure. So this is another early test. I basically worked on one sim. It looked great. I then ran it across a batch of all the cracks, and then because this entire block is a copy, I just copied the sims and I offsetted them, and it was working. This one was good. Yeah, this one was good. But as I said, it was quite slow, and I wanted to test what it would look if the camera was moving, if we're trying to follow the spaceship because it's leaving, what it would look like. And I did some comp blur in Nuke, and it actually looks very, very interesting with the spaceship being the focus. You know, the camera is parented to the spaceship and the environment is blurred. It looks interesting. This is interesting. These are other frames, other test frames. You can see the spaceship is closer. It's illuminating the smoke, even though the smoke is not very realistic here. This is another test from the top view. Yeah, and this is one of the final images I used, or the final comp I used. And you can see this smoke, the cracks here, they're not aligned. Okay, they're not. This is the one. This is the side I simmed at this point. This side I just flipped, and I used them. It still works, and that's in the final render. That's in the final clip. It still works for some reason, even though it's not 100% following the cracks. I would love to have done that though. Some other tests. Yeah, we're back. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Okay, so I'm gonna stop here because there's more stuff coming, and we'll continue in the next video. Thank you guys for watching, and see you in a bit.